and welcome to another edition of ASCE Interchange Live. I'm your host, John Marston, Civil Engineering Source Associate Editor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thanks for joining us today for a discussion on how civil engineers can raise the grade for America's energy infrastructure, based on the findings in ASCE's new 2025 report card for America's infrastructure. My guest today is Michael Miller, Vice President of Engineering Services at EXO. He's also a member of ASCE's Committee on America's Infrastructure and worked on the energy category in the report card. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Thanks. We're glad you're with us today. ASCE's new report card has given the nation's infrastructure its highest ever overall grade, a C. 8 critical infrastructure categories improved since the 2021 report. Unfortunately, the grades in 2 categories fell, including energy, which dropped from a C- 4 years ago to a D+ today. First, Michael, what makes energy systems so critical to our nation's overall infrastructure?
Well, energy is critical to our society. We use energy every moment of every day, every second of every moment of every day, and also electric power component of energy is considered the lifeline of all other lifelines. Without power, you can't do much. And many of these other lifelines are dependent on power. Also, and the report discusses this in more detail, is that there's an interdependency of energy on many of the other systems and infrastructure. For example, broadband, natural gas, wastewater and water treatment facilities, transportation systems, communications, building systems. All of these, of course, require power. And when power is lost, then of course it's a problem for those systems as well. But also there's upstream interdependencies as well. So the electrical power system for gas generation plants is of course dependent on the gas. And so without the gas, or without, say, water systems that are insulated so they don't freeze during winter, if they freeze, that could be a problem with the whole system and generation. So there's all these dependencies upstream from power as well as downstream.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what are some of the factors that you think contributed to the decrease in the energy grade in the report card?
Well, the grade, of course, went from a C-, which was in 2021, to a D+ and today, and that is a poor grade. That means the system is at risk. Now, what that means, or why that is, it has to do a lot with the demand. So the power system today has a tremendous spike in demand of power. Those mainly coming from data centers, AI centers, some cryptocurrency. All these require a lot of power. They require a lot of equipment, and that equipment requires power. And so we see over time, over the last, say, 20 years, a pretty steady increase in demand until the last 3 or 4 years, where we've seen a sharp raise in power requirements, mainly because of the data centers. Also, there are capacity constraints. To have the data centers, that's affecting the demand side of the equation, right? Well, the supply side of the equation, which is the generation side, also has to be beefed up. And so we are scrambling. That's a pretty good word for it, to bring on more generation faster. And that could be renewable generation, solar, wind, or gas power generation, combined cycle gas plants, or other generation, nuclear, what have you. All the generation sources that are being put on are creating a bottleneck in that integration. And the integration of generation could take from 1 to 3 years, depending on the complexity of the generation and where that generation is. So when you have demand that's being added almost monthly, and you have generation that takes a longer time to add, then you have a problem with, and you can have a problem with stability. And of course, the power system needs to remain stable at all times. It's a stability problem, and you can't just take an extension cord, let's say, and plug in a big generation station. You have to perform power system flow studies to determine when you add the generation, whether it impacts the grid around it. Maybe the grid needs to be upgraded. Maybe new lines need to be made, need to be built. And so those studies, which are like, they call them N-1 contingency studies, which means that if a new generation system gets put in place, then that study has to incorporate the possibility of the adjacent line going out of service for maintenance or for a storm event or whatever. And then the system has to be designed to be able to accommodate that. And that's based on the NERC, the North American Reliability Corporation's requirement, which every grid in the US is required to meet the standard for reliability.
Well, there's a crazy level of complexity there that people generally just take for granted. It's obvious. Well, now, how have the recent infrastructure laws, like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, how have they affected progress in the energy infrastructure?
Well, those are a good start. I mean, those infused $386 billion in climate and energy funding for over 5 years. When those laws were enacted, they were bipartisan laws, and they got complete support from Congress, and they were a good first start. As you know, or may not know, depending on this, but our infrastructure, or our electrical power infrastructure, is really rate-based funded, right? There are no typical appropriations coming from Congress that fund the electrical system, the electrical power system. And so it is locally funded. And so there's a sensitivity for price increases, of course. And so these two laws infused a lot of money. Now, some of them were related to tax credits to promote, clean energy generation, green technology, preparing for the EV fleets. But also some were also related to what's called GRIP. There's a program called GRIP, which is Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnership Program. And these are grants. And there's about $10.5 billion that were allocated just for those grants. And the grant, meaning the utility had to come up with 100%, and then the grant would match, or 50%, and the grant would match that for 100% funding. So they're not giveaway free money, and that was statewide. So every state had the ability to apply for these funds. And as of today, about $7.6 billion in funding has been allocated to over 105 projects across the U.S. and almost every state. And these are reliability-based projects, improving the reliability of the grid, strengthening structures, reconductoring lines, building smart grid technologies, designing smart grid technologies for the grid. And then other grid innovation ideas that have been implemented that really go a long way. I mean, it's a big boost. But I have to say, though, that this is a great fund, this amount of funds. But utilities are constantly upgrading their systems. So it's about double the typical upgrades every year that a utility, say an investor-owned utility, will upgrade in their system, if you spread that over the complete U.S. And so it's double the funding level, but that funds will run out, of course, eventually. And it's a good kickstart to start thinking about resilience, which is really where our grid needs to be, and focused on the next few years, is resilience and how the grid can reinvent itself to implement the change that's happening in the grid right now.
It sounds like it's a balance between maintenance of what currently exists and also ramping up for new demand as well.
Exactly, and that's another point. Our grid is aging, right? The average age of our electrical power grid in the transmission space is something over 25 years old. Not to say that old steel is bad. No, it's actually okay. In fact, there is no expiration date on steel. It's just how you maintain it, as you mentioned. Maintenance is key, and so I think we need to raise the grade. We need to focus on maintenance more, and that's actually more cost effective than building new. There's no reason to build new if these structures are well maintained and the lines are well maintained. Of course, unless there's capacity constraints and they need to be upgraded in that way. So it's a balance that has to be done, and our thinking has to be shifted from new thinking to maintenance type thinking and spending.
That kind of leans into the next question I had, which is how can civil engineers work to improve the grades at the local level and at the national level?
Yeah, so we have to encourage our leaders to be more proactive instead of reactive. And what I mean by that is, we need to focus on maintenance, restoration, and resilience, but we need to think about what's happening with these big storm events that have been hitting the U.S. almost several every year, these multi-billion-dollar events that have happened. We need to think about them in terms of being proactive and focusing on resilience. So what that means in the truest sense is for, say, structures that are being impacted by big storms, perhaps think about resilience by stocking extra material. And when these big storms occur, we should be replacing them with stronger structures and not with the same strength structure, which is actually what's been happening over the years. Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, all these storms wiped out, tens of thousands of distribution poles, and distribution poles are anything below 69 kV in voltage. So there's the standard wood poles that you might see in your neighborhood. These poles are really not designed to where they should be, which is another issue. So civil engineers can get involved by getting involved in codes and standards. Now, the reason why that's important is because those distribution poles that I mentioned that failed, they're only designed for what's called the NESC, the National Electric Safety Code level of load. And the safety code is a safety code focusing on safety, okay? Not necessarily reliability. And so to bring up the reliability, we've started at ASCE a new code, a new standard that could be legislatively used in every state and incorporated by reference through legislation to focus on reliability. And we're working on that now. I'm chair of the committee that's for the minimum design loads for structures supporting overhead power lines. And that's a very important standard that we've never had one. And so it's important to have it. And it talks about how to design lines for things like convective straight line winds. Wind events are large. They either can be large or they can be localized. Well, we need to focus on not only the large events, but we need to focus on the tornado loads, the localized events that really impact local areas. And we need to provide the tools for that. And so this standard does that. It will provide the tools for utilities to make the proper decisions to increase the reliability of their systems.
Wow, that sounds pretty expansive. That'll be great. When can we look for that standard? When do you think that's going to be coming down the pike?
We've been working on it for about 3 years now. The committee has, and that committee is a consensus committee of many from different utilities all across the U.S. And so it is a consensus standard. And when we will go out for balloting, when we complete the document, which is very close, we're about 95% there now. We'll go out for committee ballot, and then we'll go out for public comment after that. And I would expect to see it sometime early next year in 2026.
Okay. So what do you think, circling back to the report card and the grade for energy, what do you think the challenges might be facing the profession in reaching the solutions needed to raise the grades?
Well, the challenges are we need to start thinking differently about the grid. We need to start thinking about, rather than we'll fix it when it breaks, that kind of mentality where, I'll fix it when it breaks. And again, thinking proactively and thinking about there will be stronger storms hitting these systems. And what can you do as a utility to protect the system and increase reliability? And that's a challenge. That's a different thinking and a different funding on how we fund these projects or how they're funded from the utility level. Funding is a sensitive issue because it affects all of us through our rates, right? And so we have to do it in a smart way. But I will say, if we wait and we just act reactively like we've been doing for the last decade or several decades, the cost of those, say, restoration after those strong events are on average 13 times the cost of doing the doing it right the first way, right? So if you have a utility system and you can upgrade your system now, you'll spend $1. If you wait until after the post disaster response, that's going to be 13 times as much. So it just makes logical sense to fund these things the best way that you can, doing it the smart way, and of course getting the support from your legislators where you can, and inform the community what you're doing, because civil engineering is really a big part of it. There's also electrical engineers involved, of course, mechanical engineers. So all these engineers, the groups work together to develop the grid as it stands now, and it's important to do it together. So thinking outside the box, also incorporating or encouraging new technologies, right? So, we like to, and we're civil engineers, we like to do things kind of a standard way or comfortable in that space, but we need to think outside the box and think about newer technologies. What about hydrogen fuel cells? What about small or micro nuclear devices that can produce up to 20 megawatts of power? All these have trade-offs, of course, and they need to be evaluated, but they're there. I mean, these technologies are available to us, and we just need to implement them at utility scale, which requires some different thinking, but it can be done. And I think the challenges are ahead. I think it's great that we have these opportunities, and civil engineers, young civil engineers, new civil engineers in the industry, the future is so bright because there's so many things that we can do. And it's all going to benefit all our society, benefit the whole U.S. and really everyone in the world for these things.
That's a pretty good note to wrap up on, I'd say. And I appreciate that. I appreciate your time today. Thanks for being with us, Michael.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
It was a really enlightening discussion. Appreciate your time today on how we could raise the grade for energy infrastructure in the future. And so thanks again. Learn more about the new report card and the energy grade at infrastructurereportcard.org. And learn more about ASCE's Interchange series by visiting asce.org/interchange. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.